Namaste and welcome everyone to our continuing evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Narad, are you with us?
Namaste, Alina.
Namaste.
And welcome back home, especially to the ashram.
We're very happy to have you with us. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste, and namaste to Narad especially, to whom I owe this series. I would never have started it if not for his constant insistence and support throughout. So it's your series. It's called Evenings with Sraddhalu, hosted by
Narad. We are happy to continue today on our current theme, the current affairs, and today part 8. And we will be exploring the actors who are disrupting the globalist agenda and they're pushing back. As usually, we might have more questions that we will be taking in the next sessions, so you can send them at our email ID integralstudies.in@gmail.com. And I don't know if I should start addressing the first question.
You can take the first 3 questions.
Okay. Shall I take them one by one or
Yes.
all 3 together?
Yes.
One by one.
Yes.
Okay. Dolores, she was writing, Putin was also fundamental to restore people's faith and supported religions, which was so important to unite the Russian culture.
Yes. This is something quite extraordinary, which we really need to fully appreciate. And I will elaborate a little on this before we move to the overall theme. If you go back to something like 1930s and 40s, when you had the full communism of the USSR and Russia in the middle of it as literally the one holding the communism, and the anti-religious, materialistic ideology that comes with communism, at that time, unusually, you have Edgar Cayce, of whom we have spoken before, in the United States, speaking of Russia as the protector of Christianity in the future. And this is something so extraordinary, people at that time couldn't believe it. And by which he meant also not Christianity in its typical church form, but the deeper spiritual and mystical content of Christianity, which he foresaw as necessary. Coming from within the Christian framework, that was what he saw as the spirituality available in the West. And he spoke of Russia as the one who will protect spirituality and the resurgence of Christianity from Russia. It was unbelievable then. Even after the USSR broke up, the Soviet Union broke up, and then you had Russia separate, we didn't see any signs of this. It was only after Putin's coming into power that we find this return to faith. So in Dolores's comment, she writes faith with a capital F, suggesting not just the belief system but the deeper mystical dimension of it. And he supported religions, did not limit himself to Christianity, allowed other traditions also to flourish within the overall framework of whatever was legally supported. But that freedom was provided, and so you have the sudden rise of yoga in Russia particularly, and Christianity in its mystical and sometimes orthodox formats. And this became the focal point around which the deeper values of Russian culture could finally re-emerge and reunite. And so if you look at the big picture of what happened in Russia through the communist phase, it was as if the exaggerated rigidities of the religious forms as well as the feudal framework in which those had emerged got crushed, washed out. But the re-emergence of something deeper and truer had not taken place until after Putin began to support this. And so it's a very important observation to make. And there you see the justification of Edgar Cayce's foresight or prophecy of which direction it would go. Similarly, and I'm drawing parallels between these disruptors across the world, in India, it was only after the return of Modi, after coming of Modi as Prime Minister, that you can see the emergence of the deeper mystical yoga as well as Hindu traditions, the Sanatana Dharma, the deeper spiritual foundations of the Indian civilization itself coming up in a prominent way. And I'm going to point to a few of these things. He was, I think, within a year of coming to power, he instituted June 21st as the International Yoga Day and organized through the Indian embassies all across the world, literally thousands of people in each country, to do basic Surya Namaskar. It's a 12-step cycle of asana positions. And in this way propagated the worth of yoga, but also brought it to a level of legitimacy where the government was saying this is important without reducing it to a religious or other form. And at the same time, he instituted what was called the Ayush, the Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, and Siddha medicine, and other homeopathy. Ayush is the department he creates. I think it was already there, but he amplified the power of the Ayush department, gave it the necessary strength and funds and legitimacy again. This is very important, the legitimacy aspect. As he traveled in his first 4 years all over the world, everywhere he went, the innate Indian traditional forms of greeting, forms of dress, forms of or values were always amplified as norm rather than deprecated by what was earlier the Nehruvian value, which was an attempt to imitate the British. So he would deprecate anything Indian and look down upon it, criticize it, and if anything Indian had to survive those first 70 years of India's freedom, it was always as a second-hand surrogate child and not of an innate respectful form or value. So if you saw typically in a public setting, and I know many cases where this was attempted, people demonstrated it, they would say, who among here is Christian, and they would raise their hand. Who among here is Muslim, they will raise their hand, and any other religion. Who among here is Hindu, and people would look at each other, wait for someone to raise their hand before they would hesitantly raise a little finger and say, yes, but you were ashamed to label yourself Hindu. And I know this because I grew up in the ashram, and I had this issue when somebody came to our house for taking a census and they said, what is your religion? I said, no religion. Because I don't have a religion that I'm following. I'm spiritual but not religious. You know that phrase you see so often in the new age today. And so the guy writes Hindu. So by definition, any Indian who says I don't have a religion or I don't follow any fixed religious tradition is a Hindu. So the next time, 10 years later, when they came for the census, they asked what religion, I said Hindu. But something had changed meanwhile. I was traveling somewhere in the Himalayas and I saw this little sticker which had been placed on houses in one of the villages. Proudly state that you're Hindu. I looked at that and said, what is this? Why is this even needed? But then when I looked at myself, I said, I cannot proudly state that I'm Hindu. I had shame in association with that name. And that's when I realized the importance of that label. And then it was subsequent to that I said, okay, I'm Hindu. If that's the label, if that's the definition of Hindu, the problem, of course, with that word is it a racial type? Is it a cultural type? Is it a religious type? Is it a spiritual value system? Because it's not an innate word to the Indian tradition. It's an outsider's name. It's the Iranian tradition which referred to the Indian people as Hindu. And from there it spread through the Middle East to Europe. So the name is not innate to the Indian tradition. We don't have a name for the Sanatana Dharma, the eternal spiritual foundation. If you had to translate Sanatana Dharma, eternal spiritual foundation is the basis of the tradition. It's so wide, it's so broad, you cannot put groups. Of course, you have innumerable subgroups. But Hindu, what does it mean? I don't know really. But now that I have a definition which the government has given me, I can say, okay, I'm Hindu. What does it mean as a practice? I don't know. But it's just a label. But still to say it proudly. And so after Modi coming to power, when the values and the traditions began to be respected from the Prime Minister down and amplified and supported, the mainstream media, which was largely the anglicized leftist media within India, was very upset and kept referring to Modi as religious fundamentalist and his party as fundamentalist party. But this was only a reactionary labeling tactic that they have used. But this was very important because it allowed for the first time the civilizational values of the Indian culture to again come up. It's not the label. It's the fact that we can respect the ancient traditions and values which are at the basis of the culture, and that could come up, and it had the power to unite the people as well as prepare the way for a more direct spiritual opening. So again, I'm drawing here a parallel between Putin and Modi in what they did. Trump, it's not so obvious. You do have pictures of him where you have some of the Christian evangelists or priests who put their hand on him, and there's one photo which was amplified by the mainstream media. It was again intended to criticize him, where you have a group of about 20 people and they put their hand on him, and he's sitting in the Oval Office on the chair. They put their hand on him and they are all in prayer, invoking the protection of the divine, of God on Trump, and he's himself in a state of concentration and prayer. And they labeled it, of course, as religious fundamentalists backing Trump or Trump backing religious fundamentalists. What you see actually in his statements as well as in his actions, he did not back any fundamentalism. On the contrary, like Putin and like Modi, they opened the way for deeper spiritual values within the religion to emerge without any particular slant or bias towards any one of them. And then, of course, within the US, you have the religious groups which are a necessary part of the voters, and there were statements made in that direction, but nothing which was critical or inimical to others. So this is again a common feature among all three. And I am glad it was brought up because it was something I had not touched upon earlier. We can look at the next question.
Maureen.
Narad, feel free to say anything if you want to add. Yes.
Maureen, where do you feel President Xi and the Chinese government fits into the global agenda going forward, and how is this reflected in BRICS countries?
Yes, so this is an important question, and I'm not sure I can give a very clear answer at the moment. President Xi, who is now head of China in the same way as Putin is heading Russia, and they have both elevated themselves to a level where they hold power without being bound to electoral processes. That's the common feature among both. It is not clear to what extent he is controlled by the globalist cabal or to what extent he represents a resistance to it. That part is not clear to me, so I cannot say anything very clear about that. But what did happen, and it started earlier, was the formation of what is called the BRICS countries, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then more recently several others have been added, which are trying to form as if a coalition of economic and other interests for mutual support. And this formation of the BRICS is important. It can also become the basis for a more unified or equal global order which bypasses the UN, which unfortunately is apartheid. So in the United Nations, you have these 5 countries in the Security Council who have the right to override any other. And just this, and Sri Aurobindo points to this as the defect of the United Nations, and points out that just as the United Nations came to replace the earlier structure which was formed after the First World War, League of Nations, which was insufficient, and the UN came to replace that. And when it formed, Sri Aurobindo comments that this too has this double layer, and so it will have to give way to something else, a more equitable framework in which every country will have equal say. Necessarily their power of influence will be dependent on their population, economic strength and other things. That's reasonable and acceptable, but they should have equal say. You cannot have one country overriding others. So this BRICS is as if an attempt to bypass the limitations of the UN to form some kind of an economic framework initially. So just the fact that it exists is a good sign. What form it will take is difficult to foresee, but it forms a bulwark against cabal interests unless it gets hijacked at some point. But as for President Xi, for me it's still an open question. It's possible that within the Chinese Communist Party there's a split. There's a group which is very strongly part of the global cabal, and then there is a group which is not. But this group which is not is still weak, does not have the strength to override the other, and it's possible that President Xi is part of this group. But we will see in the coming 1 year particularly what form it takes. But the reason why I say President Xi is likely in the good group is because of certain events which I will be narrating today, where he brokered a peace deal which was part of a larger action which Trump had initiated in the Middle East. So when we come to that, you will appreciate that. We can look at the third question.
Revati made a comment. I'm guessing that Mohammed bin Salman could be a disruptor too.
Yes, Mohammed bin Salman currently as the head of Saudi Arabia, or the prince in waiting, but basically he is the royal prince today, and he is a disruptor for a fact. And we'll be elaborating on this today when we discuss certain aspects of Trump and the action he took for the world peace. So the theme for today I have titled The Peacemakers, and we will briefly touch upon actions both of Modi and Trump. Remember, and I'm connecting this to discussions the last few times, you don't have to like them. If you feel triggered, if you feel upset, if you don't like them, it's fine. We have to value them in terms of their actions. They can be egoistic, they can be dominating, they can be impolite, they can say nasty things. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, maybe it's the media lying to you. None of that matters, because politics is a different ball game and you need a certain thick skin to survive politics. What matters is the intention with which they act, and since I will not comment on intention because I have no right to say that, I watch the action and how the actions align to their words as well as to larger evolutionary interests. So we'll keep that as our reference. So regarding Narendra Modi, we go back now to the origins of where he comes from. And this is extremely important because when you come into your own in a position of power, your consciousness often reveals what was hidden. So Mother makes this observation: give a man lots of money and lots of power and you'll see his true nature. Till then you can be hiding. But there's another thing: before you come to power and before you come into public domain, what are your driving principles while you were young when you didn't need to hide? That's another part where you see what are the overall broad directions, I would even say, of the soul aspirations and the nature of their work. And these can change, these can get covered up, but at least you get a direction. So what you find with Modi is that as a young child, he is helping his father sell tea on the railway station during the breaks of his school. Hard work, honest work, poverty, struggling through poverty with honesty are part of the culture in which he grows up. He comes from a family which is a business family, and which gives him a certain innate knack for handling financial resources, but rising from extreme poverty. When he becomes a young man, there is a pressure from the family to get married. He gets married, fulfills his responsibility, so to say, to get married, and then walks out of the marriage. Now that's not a nice thing, I agree, but it's showing his temperament and tendency that he wanted to become a monk. He leaves family life, goes to the Himalayas, spends 2 years there wandering as a monk, and he does not say what happened, but something happened there. He was sent back. Sent meaning some intervention took place. He comes back and wants to live as a monk. He goes twice to the Ramakrishna mission and asks to be initiated into a monk order. Each time he is refused. He's sent back, he's sent back, he's sent back. And that's when he joins service to the nation. He is part of the RSS, where the whole culture is of service to the country, love for the country, and all else is secondary. So he dedicates himself to serving the nation. What many people don't know is that when the BJP came to power politically, Modi was always a key player in each of the major steps. Those of you who know the politics, when the Advani took the chariot ride, it's called Ratha Yatra, from which took the BJP from 2 seats in the parliament to something more than 80, I don't remember the number, just like that, overnight. That whole Ratha Yatra, a key organizer was Narendra Modi. Again, subsequently, I think it was Advani who took a trip from Kanyakumari to Kashmir, going through all the states of India. Modi was a key organizer there. He was always behind the scenes. He was always in a spirit of service, but with a large vision and the dynamism to execute that vision. And so later, when Gujarat as a BJP state was embroiled in factionalism, the RSS selected Modi, bypassing the political process, and put him in position. This is very important to understand. For someone to work through the political process, inevitably either you have to be corrupt, or you get corrupted, or you get controlled because you have made compromises which you can be blackmailed against. So he is made to bypass all that and put directly as chief minister. And from the point he comes to power, you see Gujarat changing very rapidly. The factionalism is eliminated. As I discussed last time, there is a need to centralize and dominate, to clean up the old culture and replace with a new. And there is, I believe it was 12 years in all that he was in Gujarat, viciously attacked by the media. And at that time, what he did with Gujarat to turn it from what it was economically to what it became, law and order, practical changes, governance changes, organizational changes, cultural changes, the story is too big to narrate within a few minutes. And I'll give just one example. Everywhere in India that you go to this day, if you go to the police station to file a complaint, the police will resist filing a complaint. They will listen to you, they will say nice things and then say, but why do you want to file a complaint? It's too trivial a matter, ignore it. Why? Because a police station is valued or awarded by the number of complaints that it receives. And under the British system, the lesser the number of complaints, or if the number of complaints drops, then they get awarded as a better police station. If the number of complaints goes up, then it is considered that they didn't do their job, so they get chastised, criticized. Now think about this. A rationale which was perhaps valid 100 years ago under British rule, today is a huge problem, because the number of police per population is very low in India. And you need help, and they refuse to register a complaint because they don't want their numbers to go up. And Modi actually gets down to the nitty-gritty of governance problems to this level and says, but why is this there? He removes that rule. No more is a police station valued in terms of number of complaints. And now policemen are happy to take any number of complaints without worry. This is a very small example, but it shows you the kind of change which was needed, which nobody bothers. Career politicians will never bother. Bureaucrats do not care, because this could have been done in the last 70 years. And having done in Gujarat state, why is it not yet done in all other states? Maybe some have subsequently followed, I don't know. But when he did it, none of the other states followed through and said, here's a good example of what we can do. I'll give another example. What he would do, he would set up, so to say, not a competition, but healthy competition among all the IAS administrators of the state. And every year they would meet for a 3-day think tank, where the Modi as chief minister would sit with them and have them make presentations of what innovative changes they've been able to bring about, what were the results, give a study, give a presentation in a way that others can emulate and replicate the benefits of what you have been able to achieve. And he will himself sit through and observe and watch, encourage and make his comments. And he would ask them, what are the problems you face? What are the difficulties you have? What can I do to ensure these problems are removed? Now, just this as an example, you will not find any other chief minister in India who has done it in this way. The attempt to just change the culture, to bring it to a growth. And so when he finally becomes prime minister, they would keep referring to the Gujarat model for the rest of the country. And at that point, other states got upset. So they began to speak. I think it was Tamil Nadu. Somebody said, we have a better model, Tamil Nadu. And somebody else says, we have a better model. And Modi's comment as prime minister was, excellent. I want you to have a competition between states for a superior model. Find your own model, create, improve, let the country grow because of this. This kind of thinking, this kind of pushing forward of growth, etc., was not present in the Indian public sphere from the British times to until now. But this would have been probably the case going back many centuries. He also amplified, for example, the development for all as his slogan. And the result which I mentioned before, electricity, e-governance, the unified sales tax system in the country, the online governance systems to bypass corruption, and so on. All these things came as a result. But what I'm pointing to is underlying was this idealism and a preparation which took place, which shows you the direction and inclination of his, soul, nature, or nature tendencies. He also freed up the industry by removing outdated laws. One of the first things on coming to power, for a few months we would hear that every day they were removing about a dozen laws which had become outdated and cleaning up the whole system. Recasting existing regulations, deregulation of industries was one of his great things. He spoke of this minimum government, maximum governance was the slogan he brought forward. Starting entrepreneurial initiatives, startup funds, the culture of startup funds initiated from the center with finances to back it. All this happened within a very short time of a few years, which should have been done long ago. But he also tightened financial regulations to prevent misuse. So what happens typically is that the politicians are in hands in glove with the business industries, so that the industries can give them kickbacks, for which they have to create loopholes. Each time they pass a law, they'll always have tiny loopholes to benefit certain industries or certain individuals who have specialized monopolies in industries. And it's always covered up by saying, oh, it's good for the country. And so this is inevitable. This happened, for example, when Trump was in debate with Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton said to him that you have benefited from all these loopholes in the financial laws of the country, and you have taken full advantage of these to not pay taxes. Trump said, I benefited from the loopholes that you created to back your friends. And she could say nothing, because it was a fact that under her husband's and subsequently her rule, there were many things which were passed with deliberately inserted loopholes to benefit certain groups. And Trump just took advantage of those, as Elon Musk also. He is criticized for using public funds to develop some of his projects. And he says, because they are available as financial incentives, I may take advantage. If they are not available, I would find other means. So, Modi deliberately tightened the regulations and the loopholes, removing them, particularly with the foreign FCRA, Foreign Contribution Registration Act, through which a lot of external finances were coming to fund NGOs which were then going against India's interests. The funding from cabal interests particularly was what you know today happening to create the regime change within India. All these he began to block, and then the religious conversions were coming in massive scale of funding, literally billions of dollars coming into India. And it was declared, I think it was the Vatican which had declared that in India the conversion is cheap. Per dollar you can convert one person, whereas going to the US or other places the conversion price was much higher. So they preferred to redirect those funds for conversions within India. Modi also had this vision of integration of what we know as the spiritual map of India, which today is known as the SARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. This was originally started by Vajpayee, also from the BJP, because they shared in this vision, what Sri Aurobindo spoke of, what the mother drew as the unified map of India. And so Modi spent his initial few years also to initiate integration by creating common satellite facilities, which India was bearing the cost, but to benefit the entire SARC region. For road integration, he created a framework of agreement in which all the cars' number plates were unified across the SARC region. So he's actually looking ahead for a time when perhaps the borders might become irrelevant, as happened in the European Union. But already he's setting the base for that. And then electricity exchange between the SARC countries and many other things, exchange of culture. These were things which Mother had spoken of that needed to be done. He initiated all these. And finally, one of the key things he did, but it took a while, was the liberation of Kashmir. Kashmir had become a stronghold for what we would call a mafia, and which then was linked to the global cabal and became a point of great suffering, not only for the Kashmiri people, but also a source of terrorism all over India. And by removing Article 370, he actually liberated Kashmir. And I'm using this phrase very deliberately. I was once at Srinagar for one of these conferences, and a lot of young people were there. And as you know, there are all these political activists. And as part of it, the conference, maybe 100 people, some of the young people started suddenly raising slogans. We demand freedom. We demand freedom. So it went about for a while. And then when I got my chance, I asked them this question. Freedom from what and for what? And they had no answer. I said, you are already free to demand freedom. You can say what you like. Nobody is going to stop you. You are already free to do exactly what you want, other than the basic laws of, I will say, decency or non-corruption, but non-criminal acts. Other than that, within the overall constitution, you are already free to do everything. What freedom are you asking for? And they actually had no answer. Finally, I said to them, this sloganeering itself is coming not from your need, but from a programming from your politicians who demand freedom to not be accountable to the funds they receive. And I said, in Kashmir, the central government is pumping funds from the taxes taken all over India, and the amount of funds pumped per person in Kashmir is like between 10 to 100 fold compared to what goes to a typical state in India. And in spite of that, after so many years, where do you see any sign of development? I said, even in Srinagar, which is like the gem of the whole of Kashmir region, the development is so poor. You go to any other city in the country, you will find Srinagar is like 50 years back, and Kashmir is still villages without roads. Somebody made a comment, Switzerland has only 20 lakes, Kashmir has 2,000. And my observation was, how can I travel to those 2,000? You don't even have the roads to be able to travel to 2,000. You go to Switzerland, you can travel to those 20 lakes with the best facilities. Here you cannot even travel to one lake beyond Dal Lake, which is in Srinagar. And it was a shock for them to think like that. I said, you go and visit the rest of the country and then come back and talk to your political leaders and demand that they take action. And it stopped that whole discussion of freedom. In fact, Modi freed Kashmir by removing Article 370, which prevented the rest of India from interacting with the region of Kashmir financially. An Indian could not hold property within Kashmir, and a Kashmiri could not pass on the property to a girl child. It was so anachronistic. And Kashmir had its own independent flag, and it was ridiculous. So all that has been removed. Today the integration is much better and Kashmir has been freed. So this was one of the very important things. I remember because till the point it was done, if you asked anybody, any political commentator, they all said it's impossible. Article 370, nothing can be done. He did it. Modi did it. Another thing which he took up, and I'm putting this in the category of peacemakers, because India always had a problem with Bangladesh, because during the partition, not only with what was West Pakistan, but with East Pakistan, there's a huge border, very similar to the US, very porous. And you have all the time illegal immigrants going into millions. And so it was under Vajpayee that they put a border barbed wire. Even then, the weird part was India had pockets, a village which belonged to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh had a pocket of one village which belonged to India, based on the majority of the village population at the time of partition, and yet several such enclaves across both countries. And between the two, therefore, the borders were impossible. They were porous all the time. So what Modi actually did, he engaged with Bangladesh and they swapped lands and created a clean border and removed all these little enclaves. And I remember when it was happening, I had friends who were in politics, they said, what's the point of taking up such a contentious issue? Why not just ignore it as it has been done for the last 70 years? No, he took it head on and cleaned it up, and there is no more any problem with the border. You still have porous areas, but largely because of political interests in West Bengal which need voters. Very similar to the US, the situation there. But this is just to show you an example of changes which are radical, challenging, but cleanly done very rapidly. And then deliberately he bypasses or resists the globalist trade structures. What had happened till then was the attempt to create these global laws and imposing on all countries equally. Under WHO for health, under the trade, there was the trade system and so on, TRIPS and others. And India was always being bullied, and then the smaller countries had no choice. They were all bullied to the advantage of the wealthier and more powerful militarily countries. And what Modi did was he resisted those on behalf of the other smaller countries and began to create these, bypassing the globalist structures, mutual interest agreements with every country, not just the immediate neighborhood, but even in Africa. And if you bother to look in the news, the main headlines will ignore all these. But if you see head of such and such a country visiting India and trade deals agreements made to the benefit of India, to the benefit of those countries, but specific to mutual interests. Nobody feels they are being crushed or overridden by a more powerful country. India may be more powerful, but the mutuality of the exchange is very interesting to see. And this is all being done and as a model for other countries to follow. It's entirely in line with what Sri Aurobindo conceived of in a federal framework for the world. So this is a very quick review of examples of change Modi brought about in internal, regional as well as in world affairs. So I now come to Trump, and I want to go to something very important with Trump, which for many of you will be quite shocking. And I'm going to go through in some detail to give you an idea of what was achieved by Donald Trump during his 4 years of presidency for world peace. And that's why I've labeled this discussion today as the Peacemakers. The cabal wants a third world war. We must understand this. They want continuing wars all the time. The US at a particular time before Trump came in had troops sitting in 250 countries, military bases all over the place. For what? Ongoing local wars. They don't come on the headlines. But there's somebody dying on the other side, and occasionally the US soldiers. For what? And you don't even know. You don't even count 250. Where does that come from? And so when you start looking at these statistics, you wonder, why is it, except that the headlines shift. First it was Iraq, then it shifted to Afghanistan, and you knew nothing about what happened in Iraq after that. You were being played. What happened in Iraq was a terrible chaos. What happened in Libya was a terrible chaos after the head was overthrown, and so on. So, but since the headlines don't talk about it, you have the impression, oh, everything is fine. As now you see, the headlines have shifted from Ukraine to Israel. And what's happening in Ukraine, we don't even know. They don't bother to tell you. So, all this I'm giving as a backdrop. What Trump did, he shifted fundamentally the whole basis and turned the whole global order towards peace, with the key beginning in the Middle East. And I'm going to share this in some detail because it is so important to understand. When Trump came to power, first, he pulled out of all these globalist organizations. He's pulled out of the Paris Climate Summit and took the US out of the climate programs. The reason we will understand later when we talk about the climate change problems. But the problem there essentially was the United States was pumping money into that which was going to every other country, but the agenda for those countries was decided by others, and US had no say, and US was only spending money, and there was no verification of where the money went. It was all being misused. So he pulled out of that first. Second, he pulled out of NAFTA, which was the North American Free Trade Agreement, in which all other countries benefited except the United States. For cheap labor. He pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which Obama had promoted, and changed it. He replaced them by something better, each of them. Even NAFTA was replaced by something better, more equitable, again along the lines which I discussed with Modi. With each country, it was a different partnership, different agreement based on mutual interests. And even with the WHO, when the pandemic started with COVID, Trump cut off funding to WHO, and the reason he gave was US was pumping about $900 billion, if I remember right, approximately. China was giving about $900 million US was putting. China was putting $50 million, but China was deciding where the $900 million from the US were being assigned, and it was not in the interest of the United States. So he said, if WHO is unwilling to do what we ask them for the money we give, and we cannot control the misuse of the money, then we pull the money out. So these were practical positions. He also pushed the NATO to start paying their own way. Until then, it was the United States which was pumping money to fund NATO, and NATO had already become irrelevant because it was a remnant of the Cold War with the USSR. NATO was just receiving money and spending it And under NATO agreement originally, every country was supposed to pay 2% of its GDP. But they were paying zero and US was paying everything. So in the very first meetings with NATO, he demanded, start paying your 2%. And it was fascinating to see how he got them all to agree to it, and they all had respect for the position the United States took. So all this was breaking the cabal order structure and the cabal control system, because where the money goes is when the cabal orders what it will be used for. So the US paying $900 million to WHO was cabal money under cabal control. By cutting this off, cabal didn't have the control. So he was cutting the strings of cabal control in these globalist agencies and weakening the globalist agencies while strengthening mutual partnership of countries. But then comes perhaps what I would consider the single most important change. And it was the very first thing he did when he went out of the United States. He went to Saudi Arabia. Why? United States does not have its biggest partnership with Saudi Arabia. So why Saudi Arabia suddenly? And it was a very unusual trip. For the first time in Saudi history, at least modern history, another president and the king of Saudi Arabia did a war dance together. It was for them as if they were extending their highest respectful partnership to Trump by doing a war dance with him, holding swords, each one. So nobody understood the importance of that. And then immediately after, normally what happens is you do a war dance when you go together in partnership to war against someone else. So what is Trump and the king of Saudi Arabia going to partner on in a war against whom? This is the implicit question. The second thing they do, which tells you against whom, is that they inaugurated the Center to Combat Islamic Extremism. Who? King of Saudi Arabia, Trump, and then the leader of Egypt. These are the three people, and if you recall, there was a globe, and they all put their hands together, all three of them, touching it to inaugurate the center. And this made headlines as a picture. What is the role of the head of Egypt there? And you have to really go deep to understand what was happening there, and then you will understand the chain of events which followed, which were earth-shaking literally in international politics. So, Abdul Fattah al-Sisi was the head of Egypt at that point, who is one of these three now, inaugurating the Center to Combat Islamic Extremism. And remember, Saudi Arabia was the hub of Islamic extremism and its funding all over the world, isn't it? And in fact, it was known that Saudi Arabia was giving funds even to Pakistan for its nuclear program, and they considered the nuclear weapons within Pakistan as owned by them because they had funded it. They were funding so many other groups all over the world. The most extreme, hardcore Islamic, even the suicide bombers were part of that ideology. And that was Saudi Arabia. It was a hub for human traffic, global human traffic, including children. Why are they going together now to start this Center to Combat Islamic Extremism? The same people who have been actually backing it. And here you get a hint that within Saudi Arabia there were two groups. The hardcore Islamic financiers were not the ones who you saw in public. The king was, so to say, controlled or hijacked. His rule was hijacked by this group which held the finances. Trump aligns with the king to fight this group, and with them is the head of Egypt, Abdul Fattah al-Sisi was the person who in Egypt overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood. If you recall, just as there was an overthrow during Obama's rule, there was the overthrow in Libya. Gaddafi was removed and chaos was instituted. In Egypt, there was the Muslim Brotherhood which had taken power by overthrowing the previous president. And this was again extremist Islam of a very perverse level. And the overthrow of this Muslim Brotherhood was instituted by Abdul Fattah al-Sisi. So he actually toppled over this extremist Islam and came to power. And now they align together to combat Islamic extremism all over the world. Now, unless the Saudi Arabia changed its funding, there was no hope anywhere in the world for overthrowing Islamic extremism. So this was critical. And they do the sword dance together to fight Islamic extremism. They opened the center for to combat, declared position of combat Islamic extremism. And then there is a meeting which takes place. Trump has gone. There's a meeting that takes place which is regarding oil and other things. There's some 300 people who have come all over the world. At the end of the meeting, as they're about to leave, some of them are prevented from leaving. I believe the date is November 5th or 4th. And at that point, Mohammed bin Salman, who is not in the lineage of the king. After the king, there was one person who was bin Naif, and then bin Salman was the third in the sequence. And Mohammed bin Salman takes over, and there is a coup which takes place, a power coup, in which these other people are arrested. And all of these people who were part of the hardcore extremist Islam financiers were arrested. Key among them was this person by the name of bin Talal. He was one of the prince. He had investments in Twitter, Facebook, as one of the major shareholders, and various other companies all over the world. And so effectively, he was not only controlling the media, he was controlling the financing for the extremist Islam, he was controlling the funds to train these rebellion groups, etc. This man is put in house arrest. All his funding controls are taken over. And I believe if you saw the newspapers at that time, they said almost 200 members of royal family were in house arrest. One group that tried to escape in a helicopter to fly to Yemen, which is, remember, under control of the cabal, is shot down. The helicopter is shot down and crashes within Saudi Arabia on the border of Yemen. All this was part of the media, except it was deprecated. It was not headlines. It should have been headlines. It was such a major coup. And of course there was reference to the coup, but the whole thing was muted, and these details were not part of it. You can still search for this data, you will find it even today. And as a result of the mass arrests, for the next month or so, you found that things were changing rapidly internally. Finally, these people who had been arrested were allowed to be reasonably free, but I'm sure they're under some control still. And then Mohammed bin Salman comes to power. I'm going to go into a few details there because there's a sequence of what happens next. Bin Talal was arrested, as I said. Qatar was blockaded by Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia declared Qatar was funding Islamic extremism and terrorism across the world. They blockaded it. And all this was part of the media at that point. And Israel had also blockaded on its side, and Saudi Arabia was blockading on its side. And they overthrew not just Qatar but various other places. So bin Naif, who was the next in line after the king, was bypassed in the sequence of ascension, and Mohammed bin Salman bypassed him. And this was done in a very public display when bin Naif suddenly knelt before Mohammed bin Salman and said that I pay allegiance to you and so on. And just the transfer of power took place in public. The Prime Minister of Lebanon was invited by Saudi Arabia. He goes to Saudi Arabia and from Saudi Arabia on television announces that he is resigning. How crazy is that? Think about it. And nobody told you in the mainstream media this is something so unexpected and crazy. You cannot understand what's happening because they wouldn't tell you what was happening. There was a coup taking place against the cabal interests. And the media was upset that this was happening. So when Lebanon Prime Minister resigns, you have the US State Department which is upset and they're angry with Saudi Arabia's king. And you have the Iranian government which is upset about this. And I'm going to come back to Iran's role in this shortly. And then there is a missile attack from Yemen, from the Houthis, on Saudi Arabia's oil refineries. Very unusual. So it's as if they were pulling out whatever they could to try to sink Saudi Arabia economically. At the same time, the US Embassy in Iraq is attacked by a group which is called Popular Mobilization Unit, PMU, which is under direct control of the Prime Minister of Iraq. Trump is president. He's sitting in Mar-a-Lago in the US, and he responds to this attack against the US embassy by threatening Iran and says, for every US person killed, we will hit back 10 times harder. To Iran. Why? PMU, remember, was a coalition of Shiite militias but under control of Prime Minister of Iraq. So it's as if Iran had a control on Iraq affairs and was controlling Prime Minister. And then the person who was key to all this in the Middle East, who was controlling things, Qatar, the other countries from Iraq as well as the name slip, but Yemen and others, the person who was key, who was the primary focal point for the financing, the funding, was this person called Soleimani. Soleimani then, now after Trump threatens Iraq and puts certain strictures, Soleimani now makes a trip to enter Iraq to go and meet Prime Minister, and at that point he was on the hit list of the United States, and one of the drones shoots him down, with him a couple of other people who were also senior. Just that changed everything, because this man was the focal point for the cabal interests and their funding for organizing terrorism across the Middle East, and they were threatening and controlling so many countries and heads of countries. And just like that, the status quo changed. The interesting thing was, in the mainstream media everywhere, they praised Soleimani as a great leader. US media was praising Soleimani, who had threatened the United States, and praised him as a great leader. And all of them paid high tributes. Trump was the only one who was criticizing him, bashing him as a terrorist and so on. Fascinating to see how this works. And what you find, Soleimani was funding, well, Iran through Soleimani was funding Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas from Iranian funds. Where did those funds come from? We will come to shortly. But in the process now, in the funding line in Saudi Arabia was removed, and the funding from Iran, at least the key of the operational and coordination for the funding, was knocked out from Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran both were centers for training and funding for terrorism across the world, and extremist Islam were knocked out. What took place next? Mohammed bin Salman had taken the position as the next prince in waiting to succeed the king. And at that point, something strange happens. There's a truce which is brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia by China. So suddenly headlines overnight are that China has brokered a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia after the death of Soleimani. This is very important, because when Soleimani died, the Iranian leadership, political leadership, interestingly, did not give him the necessary importance. They made the appropriate noises, but did not bother with it. They were even relieved, because he was effectively the de facto power center, and the Quds force, which was the extremist force which was funding this regional, let's say, terrorism, had just been weakened. And now Iran and Saudi Arabia, which are literally enemies, Sunnis and Shias, going back centuries, suddenly have a peace brokered by China. Now China was irrelevant. Somebody had to take credit for it, that was all. But they had a peace deal made. And US was not part of it. And the US State Department officials and the US media actually complained that they were blindsided by this. They didn't see it coming. They don't know how it happened. How did China suddenly get involved, or how did this peace happen? Peace which could not be achieved going back centuries, which had not been achieved going back decades by the US State Department policies within the Middle East, had just been brokered by the actions that Trump had initiated. He did not take credit for the final the peace deal, but it was the outcome of the action which Trump had initiated. And Trump, when he eliminated Soleimani, then he eliminated the ISIS. I will come to the ISIS part shortly. But having eliminated the three keys of funding as well as training, suddenly now the Middle East was ready for a lasting peace. The last step that Trump took, and this was exactly 1 month before the US elections. So that is 2020 October, first week. You have this announcement that there is a Trump brokered peace deal which is called the Abraham Accords, in which Israel signs a deal with several countries, including Qatar and other Middle Eastern countries. I think there were 5 countries in all. You can look up the exact names. I'm sorry with the names, I have an issue right now. But the 5 countries together make a peace deal. Not only they will not attack each other, but among them they will have free visa exchange. Now can you imagine the countries which are rabidly anti-Israel for a few decades suddenly allow Israeli citizens to cross over their boundaries, their borders without visas, and their citizens can go to Israel without visas? How does that even happen? Where did this trust suddenly appear from? Or rather, how did the distrust vanish overnight? And you have to understand that underlying, at a common ground level, there was always some kind of a goodwill, and people wanted to be free from this cabal-controlled fake conflicts. And Trump had just cleaned out the entire top leadership of cabal control, which was the root cause for these conflicts, maintained deliberately. And the result was these peace accords could be instituted just like that. Just on this basis, Trump should have won Nobel Peace Prize. Interestingly, Obama was granted a Peace Prize for what? Immediately after the Peace Prize, he institutes wars against 4 countries, initiates wars. Trump ended all these wars. Of course, he will never get a Peace Prize, at least not until the cabal is eliminated, because they control the Nobel committees and so on. But I'm just saying, in terms of what was achieved, it is something so extraordinary as to have been the basis for headlines all over the world. And because it was election time, it was 1 month before, the entire US media deprecated this information, covered it up completely, and had headlines of totally unrelated issues, all the while bashing Trump only. And this is an example of, I want to show you how all over the world peace was brokered by Trump. And this is Middle East. This is going to be the basis for our next discussion we'll have either next time or the time after, we'll see, on wars, both in Ukraine as well as in Israel. And one of the results of this Hamas attack in Israel was to put Israel in conflict with Saudi Arabia and to threaten this Abraham Accords balance which had been set. So you have to understand, behind it all there are many complex interconnections and interests. We will look at that in some detail. It's a very complex situation, but once you understand from the cabal perspective the nature of their interests and the peacemakers' interests, the whole thing becomes so simple and so obvious and gives us hope. Because these steps are disrupting cabal agendas and redirecting the evolutionary possibilities and allowing a greater freedom to emerge among people, among nations. And it's changing in a way that it's very hard to reverse. So even now, if you see, when the Hamas, Israel is fighting Hamas, the Middle Eastern countries all grouped together to prevent funds coming to Israel, or to prevent arms from coming to Israel. It was Saudi Arabia which blocked that action and protected Israel, protected the funds and the weapons coming to Israel. Why? Because they are the good people now. How did they become from bad people to good people overnight? Because the bad people were a control group, they were eliminated. And Mohammed bin Salman represents the new face of Saudi Arabia, which is fully in line with the overall policies that Trump instituted. And I'll just touch upon this, what happened. Soon after, there is this coup. He replaces all those extremist Islamic financiers. He revolutionizes life in Saudi Arabia. I'm speaking of Mohammed bin Salman. He allows women to drive freely. Earlier, they could not drive except with a male person next to them. They are allowed to attend public programs and games and things like that, sports and various things. He began a process of removing the extremist elements of Islam, for which Saudi Arabia was so well known. Openly saying that we are against all forms of extremist Islam and cut off all funding everywhere. So it had a ripple effect across the world. Wherever these terrorist funds were coming and training for this extremist mentality, all of them suddenly weakened out. It took a while to clean up, but still the force was gone. And this entirely, the credit goes to Trump, because he could identify who were the key people who could topple, who were the key people who were the, let's say, financiers, and do a clean, incisive intervention to separate the two and liberate the elements that represented a progressive possibility, removing those who were blocking progress. Exactly the same thing happened in Iran with the elimination of Soleimani, and the Quds force weakened and their funding cut. The Iranian leadership today is very different from what it used to be before this change. And the same thing you see across many other countries in the Middle East, Lebanon being one of them, where the Prime Minister resigned while in Saudi Arabia. Isn't that the most weird thing? And then he goes back and then withdraws his resignation, and a whole chain of other events. But this shows you that something very important was happening which was never explained by the mainstream media. And you will not understand unless you understand this background of what was happening between the cabal and Trump and the battle between them. So I think this is as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned. Now you understand the meaning of the sword dance and why the king of Saudi Arabia welcomed Trump with so much respect and did the sword dance together. So this is one example, and I'll touch upon a few because that's not the full scope of what Trump did. Saudi Arabia was also the hub of human trafficking, as I mentioned before, not only women but also children. And if you go back a few decades, it was known that children from India used to be kidnapped and taken to the Middle East. They would be tied to camels and used as camel drivers in the camel races run by the rich. Afterwards, the same children would be raped or sold as slaves, or organs harvested and all kinds of things. This was a continuous pipeline which was passing through Saudi Arabia that was completely stopped. And this is entirely because of Trump. One of the things Trump did, and I believe the date was 2019, December 21st. I remember this because it was such an important event. He passed a law that gave the United States military the right to seize all properties from anybody involved in human trafficking. This is something new. Trump instituted a massive counter-trafficking action on many levels, but this was one of the factors of that action, where entire properties could be seized just like that. Something similar you see Modi did in a very much smaller scale, nothing to do with human trafficking, where they said that anybody who is an economic offender and goes away to another country, their properties can be seized by the Indian government. A small step, but something similar. Trump, by the way, teamed up also with the Indian government to end the human trafficking. And what you saw at that point, suddenly all over the world, because of this one action of Trump, you had a distinction made to protect children in all social media. For example, even today on YouTube, anytime you upload a video, you have to tick a box that says this is made for children or not made for children. If it's made for children, then YouTube does not allow you to save that link or to mark it with as a favorite, and all kinds of other controls are there. And if you violate that, if you wrongly tick, then you get exposed to extreme action from the military, US government or other governments, where they can seize your property. So it's a small tick, but just that you're agreeing to something which opens you to a very sharp action if it involves some misuse to protect children. And why is this so important? If you go back to a few sessions ago when we spoke of how children were being attacked by the Satanist cabal agendas and what was needed, one major action was the trafficking, but the other side was this protecting children from being exposed to these predators, let's say, who want to damage and harm them. And so Trump starts this program. It has ripple effects across the world. And suddenly in India, we had headlines for human trafficking network taken down, 60 people released, so many people arrested, and so on. And in the United States, one of the things which should have been headlines, 200 children freed from human traffickers. And it never touched headlines. Isn't that amazing? Recently, under Biden, where there is this influx of about 2 million illegal immigrants every year for the last 4 years nearly, 80,000 children which were under child protection custody in the US under government institution, 80,000 have vanished. That is, they're untraceable. They were under government protection and control and they've just vanished. No headlines. And that tells you the media is complicit, or the people who control the media are part of this game, and they don't want you to know. This was such an important change that Trump brought about, and again it had a global impact. It was not just limited to the US. I'm going to one more thing which Trump did. Again, this is for the peace for the world. And this was, he ended ISIS. The head of ISIS was finally killed. And it was a special forces operation that the US had initiated. Trump was watching it live. And later he made comments about how the fellow ran like a dog. And the media criticized Trump for having eliminated the head of ISIS by saying, oh, you were disrespectful to that man. Isn't that weird? But we come to what happened. How did Trump eliminate ISIS? Because under Obama, ISIS was growing literally day to day in strength, in scope, in wealth, financially and militarily. How did ISIS come about? And this is something quite amazing, and you have to look at that history and then see what Trump did. And it just did a very surgical intervention to change the game, and the whole thing was done in 2 years. ISIS was eliminated. Where under Trump it had been growing for 8 years. Under Obama it had been growing for 8 years. What happened? So we look at what happened first in Iraq. When post 9/11, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and yet the US entered Iraq because of supposed weapons of mass destruction, which were proved to be entirely false. The CIA had pictures which it released of those weapons of mass destruction, which were entirely cooked up. Every media talking head had lied to you, and they're the same people who have been lying to you all the time till now. Never trust them. So, unless they apologize and say, we made a mistake and we will never make that mistake again, they cannot be trusted. So what happens then? US enters Iraq, topples Saddam Hussein, creates chaos, division under so many groups, etc. To this day, Iraq is in a mess. And interestingly, they trained an entire force to organize and control Iraq. Now, it's not like there wasn't a force before, because obviously it was working before they had peace going back many decades under Saddam Hussein. Now they train a whole new force with US equipment, with US arms, and then suddenly the US says, okay, we can't stay anymore, we pull out, leaving behind all the weapons, all the arms, all the missiles, all the trucks, and all the trained people. They had 2 people who were part of the terrorist group they had arrested, who were in the Guantanamo Bay for more than a year. These 2 are released under Obama. They come back to the Middle East, they come back to Iraq, Syria, other areas, and now initiate the ISIS with the people that the US trained, with the equipment that the US left behind, and with all the organization that they had. Isn't that amazing? And these are the people trained. They were held in Guantanamo Bay, released, and they take over. It's not by chance. This was a cabal operation to create ISIS. And ISIS now keeps growing because they're selling oil through Syria. They had a whole pipeline, they had trucks going. And if you look at the pictures that they released, the trucks they had, and there was a question which the US, the good side of the US intelligence agencies asked, where do they get all these Toyota trucks? And they asked the Toyota company, how is it they have only Toyota trucks? What are you doing? So, whenever there's an insurgency of any kind or terrorism of any kind, it's very easy to recognize who's funding it. First, you look at their fund sources, you look at the weapons they use, you look at the explosives they have, the vehicles they use, communication equipment, their style of operation and training, which is also specific to a country which is backing them, and who in the mainstream media is giving them primary support. That tells you the whole story of who's behind. It's very simple. So recently in Africa, there was one country, one group toppled another, and I think it was an eastern part of Africa, and China was backing them. You know who's behind, because they had Chinese weapons, they had the Chinese media backing them. You know what the game is. So who was behind ISIS? And all the time you had these statements coming from the United States and a few other countries, but remember there were cabal focal points within these countries. And what were they aiming for was to create this large land across borders of 2 or 3 countries, which was entirely controlled by them, and spreading the most rabid extremist Islam. They were burning people alive. The things which we know happened in India under the extremist Islam going back 800 years. For 800 years. You saw ISIS doing exactly that. It means nothing had changed. It's the same crude, extreme, perverse form. It's not even Islam at that point when there's no religion or spirituality. It's just an ideology, which is most crude. And it's growing. Why? Because they're continuing to receive funds from sale of oil, $1 billion a year approximately. Now at that point there was a problem happening in Syria. There were certain attacks, there was use of gas apparently, and mainstream media kept pushing Trump to send missiles and to start a war, and Trump resisted war. Trump is the only US president going back at least 100 years now who was not a war president, who did not start a new war, but who ended all wars during his tenure. So he is resisting, and the media is pressing him. The US State Department is pressing him to bomb. And at some point, interestingly, Trump says, okay, and gives an order to bomb. What is interesting after that was what you have to just watch what happens next in the media. As soon as the news of the bombing happens, I believe it was some 75 or 79 missiles which were shot by US ships in the Mediterranean, all in the region of Syria. The headlines said only 50% accuracy, which is very odd. But then all the talking heads, all the newscasters suddenly start praising Trump. For the first time since he has been elected, everybody was praising him. And I remember seeing some of these videos. There was one man who was a major public speaker on the news shows who says, "Oh, what a presidential action by Trump. Oh, look at the beautiful missiles which were shot." That's the kind of praise. And it lasted barely 24 hours. Immediately after, the same media turned against Trump and said, "Stop these missiles, you're creating destruction, you're killing people." Why? Because one of the stories that came out was, in Syria, a hospital was bombed. Now, this is going to be important because you'll have to connect it to what's happening today in Israel and with the Hamas. A hospital was bombed. As it turns out, if you look at the actual data and the photographs of that hospital, it was not a regular hospital. The hospital was a cover. It was a center for development of nuclear technologies and nuclear weapons. What Trump did, why there was a 50% hit rate, was he had his people change the targets. So it hit a few in Syria. The others were on the border of Syria and in the areas controlled by Iran and the Quds force, and various others, financial pipelines of the ISIS. All of these centers of ISIS were bombed out. So suddenly the cabal turned against Trump once again after praising him, thinking they had got their objectives done, they turned against him. So this is just an example of how he played them each time. And subsequently, what happens next? The ISIS continued to grow because under Obama there was a deal made with Iran. If you remember, the agreement was very strange. It was a private agreement which was never passed by the US Congress. It was kept secret. I believe to this day the Congress does not have the full text of the agreement, where Iran agreed in a private deal with Obama to say that we will not spend money to make nuclear weapons for the next 5 years, and we give you our word. That's all they did. For which so many $1 billion of funds would be released by the US. Now, some of the funds were apparently funds owned by Iran, which were frozen by the US. So those funds were released, and then separate funds were provided by the US as money given to Iran in cash. Now, this is also a very weird transaction because the funds were owned by Iran in its financial currency, riyals or something. And under a special permission given by the Obama government, these funds were converted to US dollars and then converted to euros and then released for Iran's use. And at the same time, I think it was 3 planes which flew, unmarked planes, gigantic military planes, full of cash in euros of some $1.6 billion or so. I may be off on the numbers a little bit, 1.6, 1.5 something. So some $4 billion or so of funds released, converted to euros by US permission, and then cash pumped to Iran in euros. Now, why would you do that? Now, if you are paying money to somebody, even if it is money to release, to make a promise, however stupid it may be diplomatically, you would use your finances in your currency because you can print it, it's yours. You don't get currency in foreign exchange from some other country for which you have to pay a higher price. Why would they pay in euros? Because Iran having euros, they can spend it not in Iran, not in the Middle East, not in the US, but in Europe. They needed to buy things from Europe, which included, of course, weapons, training, equipment, etc. And all this was going to Europe, and from Europe, maybe there were other circles, it was funding the cabal operations. So it was actually slush funds released for cabal operations, which then were rerouted and became the basis for financing of the ISIS. How do we know this? Because it comes from the equipment and the funds that they used. The same way as today, if you ask Hamas, who's backing Hamas? Look at the equipment they use, the funds they use, and who's backing them when they are attacked or when their heads are eliminated, which country gets upset, and you see it traces back to Iran. So Saudi Arabia was fighting Iran, which was cabal controlled through Soleimani. The same cabal was sending the same funds to ISIS, which was growing in strength, trained by the US forces, unfortunately, and with US equipment, and so many other. Yemen, which is again, Houthis are funded by Iran. Syria, again, there was a group from Iran that was being funded, and all this operation was funded from those funds on the basis of a promise that they will not develop nuclear weapons within their country. But technically, they could develop it within Syria, and that was one of the centers for weapons development and nuclear research, which Trump bombed. So they all got very upset. Now, all this is to show you the extent to which things had gone out of control. Everything was in a flashpoint with technological capability even to make it worse, and a third world war eventually in some form or other. Israel is the only country today in the Middle East which has nuclear weapons other than Pakistan. And if Iran had successfully developed nuclear weapons, you would have had a nuclear conflagration there. For sure. Because they were not building weapons to defend themselves. They were building it for offensive purposes. See the mentality of Israel and Hamas. Hamas has weapons for offense. Israel has weapons for defense primarily. So you see the difference always and understand the underlying rationale for these things. So we come back to ISIS. When Trump comes to power, what does he do? First, he cuts off that agreement with Iran, which got the media very upset. Because now, as long as the agreement was there in place, the US could not intervene in Iranian affairs because they had an agreement. Trump stops it, blocks further funding, and can now openly threaten Iran to fall in line or be attacked, which could not be done under the agreement. Next, what he does, as we already saw, he eliminated the funding centers, both in Saudi Arabia as well as in Iran, and Soleimani as key person there. And then in Qatar, which was another center for the funding that was done through Saudi Arabia. And then the most interesting part, in the battle against ISIS, where the US was getting more and more embroiled, there was a very weird clause put. There was a list of people who were, let's say, the hierarchy that had to be killed. Officially, there was permission to kill them using drones. But Obama had this one little rider that anytime someone was identified by the drone and they were sure it was that person, they needed to take permission all the way to the president's office. So they would identify someone, the drone is now sure that this is the person, the US military has verified it, it goes up the chain of command. You cannot shoot, you cannot fire the missile. And by the time it reaches the president's office, maybe it's middle of the night because of time zone differences, and an okay comes, more than 15 minutes have passed, sometimes half an hour, and that person escapes suddenly. So it happened repeatedly that they would identify some key person and the person would soon escape. Trump changed this. He said, since we have agreed this person can be eliminated, the moment you find him, you have the right to fire the missile. Don't wait for clearance from above. That clearance is given. And so, immediately, from the point Trump gives this order, one by one, the leadership of ISIS begins to be eliminated rapidly. They identify, they're sure it's someone, and the missile is shot. That's it. The work is done. So, the US media got upset over this. And there are articles you will find even today, you can search for those, and you'll find that they got upset because one of the things Trump did, you do not need to anymore reveal how much collateral damage took place from these attacks for the high value targets. Because otherwise the media would ignore the fact that this high value target was eliminated and focus on the side effects. So it was a normal strategy used from that time, and Hamas is not new with this, that under hospitals, under schools, they would have their missile bases, or they would set their rockets and other communication centers, so that if ever one of their heads was killed, there would be such a large civilian casualty that the US could be brought under pressure and prevented from further attacks. So Trump removed that also, that requirement of mentioning how many civilian casualties for high value targets, of course. So as a result, within 2 years, ISIS was finished. Today it doesn't exist anymore, except something new has happened. So the same mistake which happened under Obama gets repeated now under Biden. Trump had started pulling out troops from all those countries. Wherever the US troops were there, he began to bringing them home. And one of the major centers was Afghanistan. He started the process of withdrawal. Unfortunately, the completion was under Biden. And what happened under Biden is unexplainable by military standards. The US military pulled out. They suddenly overnight pulled out of the bases, leaving behind all their weapons, all their rockets, all their guns, all the helicopters. Some of these were stealth helicopters, the most advanced technologies. And they had been training the Afghanis to use those weapons and to fly those helicopters. They suddenly pull out, leaving behind all that equipment and US citizens. Some 10,000 US citizens were left behind. And they were suddenly caught and they could not escape. Some of them were used as hostages and so on. Now, in a normal process of withdrawal, first you take out the people, citizens, you take out the equipment, and then you take out your forces. This was the complete reverse sequence. Why? So it is presented to you by the media as if it was a stupid mistake. No, it is not. The military does not make such mistakes. This is something so basic to the military training. It was intentional. And it was the same pattern which happened under Obama, where the equipment and trained people were left behind to form a new force. And exactly the same thing has started, leaving behind $80 billion worth of advanced equipment. And it was strange to see how the media was trying to justify it, saying the cost of taking out the equipment was higher than buying the equipment. It has nothing to do with cost, it has to do with misuse. And there is a video of Biden who's saying this some more than 10 years ago, at that time when there was problem in the Middle East. He says, if you leave behind that equipment, it's going to be used against you at some point. He knows this very well. So why is it today that he does not apply his own statement? Because there's an underlying, let's say, cabal. I don't know who's involved. The cabal controls use this to start a whole new equivalent of ISIS, which today you see in the form of the Hamas. And maybe they've set up a new network, they've got their new leadership. What form it takes, I don't know. But one of the things which they had, and which was found recently, was across the US border in Mexico, there were Hamas training centers using equipment left behind by the US in the Middle East, particularly in Afghanistan. And that should tell you something. Currently, the equipment being used by Hamas against Israel all trace back to the equipment left behind by the US in Afghanistan and other sources also. So that tells you how the cabal operates for funding and supplying equipment and training to create these insurgency groups which because they control, they can easily modify their names, shift them across countries and do all kinds of mischief. So Trump ended ISIS. Cabal was upset. They had to create their own new structure. It will take a while for these to become strong enough like the ISIS. Hopefully by that time again things might change. But the ending of the ISIS was a major step. It allowed peace once again to come back in the Middle East. And that's one of the reasons why the Abraham Accords were possible at the end of Trump's tenure. And one last thing which I want to end with, which is so important and which was also orchestrated by Trump, which was the ending of the conflict with North Korea. This is also something quite amazing when you look at the deeper inside story of what happens. Trump actually flew to North Korea. All these decades since the end of the Second World War, North Korea was this bad boy, rogue state, developing its own very advanced weapons, nuclear weapons, spreading nuclear weapons technology. Between North Korea and Pakistan, there was exchange of nuclear technology and facilities and training and so on. So all the bad actors in the world were helping each other, and North Korea being one of them. For a long time, we were given the illusion that it was all a puppet of China. As it turns out, it was not. But even if China had part control of it, it was finally part of the cabal. They had their own submarines, their own air force, their own missiles, and their own nuclear weapons, owned by the cabal. And in a large part, it was groups from what I have called the rogue part of the CIA. They were working together for whatever objectives long term. Trump cut that off also. Just as he freed Saudi Arabia, freed Iran from the Quds ownership, he freed North Korea. Which is the reason why you will see, until Trump intervenes with them, the heads of North Korea, they would come on television wearing black dress, reading out a text saying US is Satan, US is enemy, we will bomb you, and so on. After Trump interacts with them, the head of North Korea now is smiling, wearing colorful shirts, moving around like a tourist in Singapore, because that control system was removed. And how did it happen? If you see the chain of events, it's fascinating. There was an entire mountain in North Korea, inside which there were 200 people working on the most advanced nuclear weapons technology and missiles technology. It's all inside the mountain. There's no way you can eliminate that, isn't it? We all know how difficult that is. Well, there is one weapon which only the US military has. I believe it's called the Javelin of God or something like that. It's a rod with some missile controls, basically, shot from space, outer space. And it comes down from high up at very high speed and slams into the mountain, penetrates because of the speed, and explodes inside. This javelin as an equipment, you'll find descriptions about it, was used there. The entire mountain imploded. The mainstream media covered it saying that there was some explosion, unknown reasons, and the entire mountain imploded, and the entire facility inside with all their scientists and research personnel all died. Just like that, overnight. And then, this is happening under Trump, and then Trump reaches out to the head of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, and there is this discussion taking place between them. Kim Jong-un makes a threat. Trump says, my missiles are bigger than yours, my button is bigger than yours. Media made fun of it. What happens next is amazing and cannot be explained unless you understand this. Kim Jong-un agrees to return the remains of the US soldiers. I believe there were some 300 US soldiers which were on North Korean soil. For decades they refused to give back their remains, and Kim Jong-un, with no other agreement with Trump, agrees to return them, and the soldiers' remains are sent back. What happened? No other agreement, no other pressure, just the elimination of this. And then he invites Trump. Trump flies to North Korea. That was also a very interesting event. The cabal was against it. They did everything possible to prevent this meeting. Trump flies to North Korea. There are agreements they sign, and you have this video of President Trump standing on the border between South and North Korea. Trump crosses over from south to north, and Kim Jong-un crosses over from north to south. Effectively, they were signaling the unification of North and South Korea. There cannot be a more dramatic peace event in recent times. the media entirely suppressed the implications of this. And Trump was going to make one last step to complete this process of the unification of the two. This meeting was taking place in Singapore. And as the meeting is about to begin, the US media went ballistic against Trump, made all kinds of perverse sexual allegations against Trump, and created such a ruckus that Trump said, all right, this is not the time for this, we will do it later. And he pulls out of that meeting. But during that time, Kim Jong-un is wandering all over Singapore, wearing these flashy, colorful dresses as a tourist, smiling, waving to the media. A completely different person from what you had seen earlier on television, where he would read out these messages criticizing the United States. So this is also a major step in world peace. Effectively, North Korea is no more a rogue state. Saudi Arabia, Iran, North Korea. Last remaining is Pakistan. Trump cut all the funding to Pakistan, demanded that they eliminate terrorism, demanded certain verification of where the funds were going, and failing which, no more funds. The result was, in practice, no other funds came. Trump realigned US State Department policies with India. Pakistan today is imploding financially and militarily because of this. Of course, subsequently, after Trump's tenure was over, there's again attempt to pump money into Pakistan, but the damage is done, and all of this has opened the way by clearing out the cabal focal points of weapons and military controls to allow for an opportunity for peace. So Abraham Accords was a direct result of this. An agreement between North and South Korea is a direct result of this. And Saudi Arabia today, as a force for peace and for a moderate Islam, Qatar and Israel now joining and supporting, backing Israel for peace in the Middle East. All this is an outcome of the work done under Trump in those 4 years. This is dramatic, and I don't think there is any other equivalent in recent history after the Second World War of a leader, political leader, being able to achieve so much in just 4 years. And I'm not spoken too much about what he has done for locally for US industries and all that. I instead have put a link in the description of today's video which describes, I think the title given is, it's an article which list of all achievements of Trump. You can just scan through if it interests you. I've also given a few other links of what I had promised, interview with Elon Musk, with Rishi Sunak, as well as with Joe Rogan, and one more link which I had also promised. But you'll find these, for those of you who are interested, do please look at these. They're quite interesting. And also last time I had given, I think, 4 or 5 links. Do look at those. They're all quite fascinating. I'm going to, because we have run out of time, I will not go through all the questions now, but please leave your questions in the chat box as well as on the emails. There are quite a few important questions which have arrived. We will take them up next time. The framework which I proposed from this point on, I have largely completed what I had intended with description of these disruptors. I have included now Mohammed bin Salman as one more of minor disruptor. The next, I propose to discuss the wars. And the theme for that I have provisionally thought of the title as the warmongers. And we will look at first what is happening between Israel and Hamas, and also look at Russia and Ukraine, and look at it from this perspective. First, understanding the background of cabal interests which want war, which don't want peace, and then the evolutionary, let's say, compulsions, as well as other nuances of finance and media and other interests, and see where this is likely to head and what it represents in terms of efforts, both for those for evolution and those against evolution of humanity and peace. It will be interesting also as a discussion, because I'll go into some of these aspects which are not so well known because the media rarely covers them. There are many questions waiting, and I would like to take them up. We'll keep them for next time, but just one little comment which I want to share is something which is from Krishna. So Alina, you could just read that.
Is this comment now on YouTube?
No,
No,
Yes, probably. No, this is
okay.
Krishna.
Yes, for about the pushback, yeah?
Yes, yes.
In your recent episode on the pushback, our last evenings with Sraddhalu, you made an insightful comment about how the cabal is indirectly funding the Pakistan military through Afghanistan via the drug trade. Recently, a few months back, the articles that looked at this development.
No. The Taliban banned.
A few months back, the Taliban banned opium production in Afghanistan, and I was searching for news articles that looked at this development in a positive light, and funnily, I couldn't find any. Almost all complained about how Afghanistan's economy would collapse. The only economy I see collapsing is Pakistan's.
It's a very interesting observation, and I'm glad that these discussions will help you now to understand, as Krishna has got it, it'll help you to understand current events much more deeply. So Krishna's observation is that when Taliban banned opium production in Afghanistan, normally media should have celebrated. Media is criticizing it. Why? Because for the underlying, let's say, cabal controls, cabal finance, this was a major source of funding. The whole of the Taliban under, let's say, the last few administrations was being funded, backed by the CIA. All the opium production was done under duress, and the opium taken would then go into the global opium trade, because that became the slush money for the cabals as well as the intelligence agencies and their, let's say, secretive operations. A lot of it routed through Pakistan. So even for the Pakistani military and the generals and cabal controls there, it became their source for funds. And the Taliban today is different from the Taliban before. And this is the reason why the Modi government has actually made deals with the Taliban in Afghanistan. So people who say Taliban is one big behemoth, no, it's not. They were actually tribes. And there were some tribes who were part of the cabal control and some who were against it. And those who are against it are actually in power by the simple fact that they have stopped opium, they have banned opium production. And they want to go back to real value of food and other means of production. So that tells you that there's a shift. And the chain reaction from that, from the media, is interesting, that they're upset. And that tells you the cabal is angry that this has happened. So all these I see as small sparkles of signs that the cabal control has weakened so much that there is a pushback taking place, and the peacemakers who have a chance all over the world to actually take a step forward or take multiple steps forward because of what has been cleared, the path has been cleared for them. And there's an opportunity for the light to grow much more rapidly. And we should seize upon it, and it should also give us hope that whatever may have been the condition before of the barrier created by the global control, it's not unsurmountable. It can be dismantled, and a few good people in a few good places, whether coordinated or not, if they're aligned to a higher inspiration, can make a difference. And so each one of us individually can also begin to make a small difference in our little areas. I'd like to invite Narad if you want to say anything.
Just to ask if you could speak a little, perhaps next time, about Narendra Modi and Sri Aurobindo. Because he has spoken to us in Oroville. He has been there twice. I have met him. Yes. And I think it would be good to cover that aspect.
Yes.
Since many of those who are watching this are devotees and disciples.
Yes. It was something interesting. I was not present there, but I heard the reports from others, and the video is now online. When Narendra Modi addressed Orovillians, it was, for many there, it was very impressive that he had nothing before him, no notes, no papers. And the kind of depth that he was able to bring in the message that he was communicating, the spiritual message, and referring to the deeper spiritual civilizational values of the Upanishads and the Veda and the place of Auroville in that whole awakening of consciousness. And that was something many, I'm told, had found it very touching. So maybe next time I will put that also as one of the links in the description. Yes. And it shows a basic alignment in the objectives and ideals and motivations of Modi's, let's say, personality as well as his role as Prime Minister with the spiritual objects that Sri Aurobindo and the Mother declared, both for India as well as the human evolution and awakening. So, yes, thank you for bringing that connection. We'll take a moment then to concentrate on this, because for me, this is a message of hope. So much change could take place so rapidly, and so many spaces now are continuing to make those changes, despite whatever may be the cabal controls globally. And so, each one of us has a chance. Use this as an occasion. Any attempt you see, any chance you see of greater freedom, higher thought, higher illumination, higher inspiration, take advantage of it and let the light push forward. First within us, and then in us and through us in our circumstances. And then depending on the space which is given to us as our responsibility, as widely as possible, and if nothing else, through prayer on all humanity. Namaste.
Namaste.